Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly kind of overlooked corner of the law. It's something that deals with a feeling we've all had, but very few of us actually know you can do something about legally. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Someone does something to you that is just fundamentally unfair. It's not like they robbed you, they didn't assault you, but it hurt you. It humiliated you. Maybe it even cost you money. And you're just left there thinking, man, there really ought to be a law against that. Well, it turns out there is. In the Philippines, there's a whole chapter in the Civil Code called Human Relations. And what it does is it basically puts a legal framework around the idea of just common decency. It's the law's way of saying that just because something isn't technically a crime doesn't mean it's okay. So, how does this actually work in practice? Well, it all starts with this one core idea. You might have a right to do something, but you can't just use that right as a weapon against someone else. This right here, Article 19, is the foundation for everything we're talking about. It's so simple, but it's incredibly powerful. It says that any right you have, any duty you perform, has to be done with justice, honesty, and good faith. The big takeaway? A right is not a blank check to cause harm. To really see how this plays out, let's look at a pretty wild case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And believe it or not, it all started with a simple pair of jeans. So here's the story. Shirley Quiñones buys jeans, she has the receipt, everything's fine. But then the store mistakenly thinks she shoplifted. Now, did they have a right to verify payment? Sure. But how they did it was the problem. They went to her workplace, confronted her in front of her clients, and then sent an accusatory letter to her employer. The Supreme Court looked at this and said, whoa, this wasn't about verification. This was an attempt to humiliate her. That's a textbook abuse of rights. And the court's ruling really boils it down to one single thing: intent. What were you trying to do? Were you trying to solve a problem, or were you trying to cause one? Because the store's actions were clearly meant to damage Shirley's reputation, their so-called right to check on a purchase crossed the line and became a legally actionable wrong. Now, this whole principle of acting in good faith doesn't just apply to shopping, of course. It gets way more personal, especially when we start talking about matters of the heart and, well, broken promises. This is a classic question, right? If someone promises they're going to marry you and then just breaks it off, can you actually sue them for a broken heart? Well, the answer is, it's a little complicated. You see, the law makes this really crucial distinction. Just a simple breach of promise to marry, on its own, you can't sue for that. The law has to protect a person's freedom to change their mind. But if that promise was all wrapped up in deceit, in fraud, or in some kind of bad faith, well, now that's a whole different story. So check out this case, Guevara versus Benach. A guy gives his fiancée 500,000 pesos as a gift. The only catch? He'd lied to her about his name, and oh yeah, he was still married to someone else. So when she finds out and naturally breaks off the engagement, he tries to sue her to get the money back. The court's response was basically, you can't come asking the law for help when your own lies created the entire mess in the first place. And you know, this whole idea of using something that seems legitimate, like an engagement or a business right, but doing it in bad faith, that actually extends to the legal system itself. The law has a way to protect you from being dragged through the courts just out of pure spite. It's called malicious prosecution. So to win a claim like this, the court needs to see 4 specific things. First, that you were actually prosecuted. Second, that you won the case. It was dismissed or you were acquitted. Third, that the case against you had no real basis, no probable cause. And fourth, and this is the absolute key, the person who filed it did it out of malice. They were using the courts as a weapon to hurt you. Okay, so we've seen how these rules work in personal fights. But what about in the cutthroat world of business or in public service? Well, it turns out the law demands fair play there too. In the business world, there's this really important concept called tortious interference. It basically means you can't just intentionally blow up a contract that exists between 2 other people. You can't just swoop in and maliciously wreck a business relationship for your own personal gain.
For a real-world example, you can look at the case of Go versus Cordero. A buyer knew that a distributor had an exclusive deal, but they went behind the distributor's back to deal directly with the supplier. When the distributor's contract got terminated because of this, the court said, nope, that's not just aggressive business. That was an illegal, bad faith interference. And what about public officials? What happens when they just don't do their jobs? Well, they can actually be held accountable in 3 totally different ways. If their failure to act harms you personally, you can sue them for damages. Their own government agency can discipline them, suspension, dismissal. And if what they did or didn't do is serious enough to be a crime, they can face criminal prosecution.
And get this. This principle of fairness holds even the government's feet to the fire. In one major case, a government department had contractors do some urgent, necessary work. They accepted the work, got the benefit, and then just refused to pay. The Supreme Court had to step in and basically said that letting the government do that would be unjust enrichment. Even the government has to play fair.
So after looking at all of these different scenarios, from a pair of jeans to a broken engagement, all the way to a government contract, what's the big picture here? Why does this area of the law even exist? Well, it's because these rules are about so much more than just settling arguments. They're like the legal guardrails for our society. They're there to promote fairness, decency, and good faith in pretty much all of our interactions. They set up bare minimum for how we have to treat each other.
All right, so what are the big things to take away from all this? First, just because you have a right doesn't mean you have a license to be unjust. Second, things like bad faith, deceit, and malice, they have real legal consequences. Third, the law can actually help you with wrongs that aren't even crimes. And finally, fairness isn't just a nice idea, it's a legally enforceable standard across the board.
And that kind of leaves us with one final thought. The law of human relations, it tells us the bare minimum of how we have to act to avoid getting sued. It defines the absolute floor of acceptable human conduct. So the real question for all of us is, how much higher than that floor do we choose to build?